So this morning, I want to talk about a topic near and dear to my heart as I have struggled with it and continue to struggle with it over the course of my life. So the topic for today is perfectionism and the Dharma, and it is a uniquely human source of suffering. I don't think my dogs suffer from too much perfectionism or other creatures. And it really has to do with our inner dialogue with all the demands and expectations that come with that, which can really be unrelenting, can really be just pretty persistent. And the irony, I think, often is that the more perfect we may appear on the outside, often the more broken we are on the inside. It takes a ceaseless judging inner critic to maintain this veneer of perfection or to attempt to maintain this veneer of perfection on the outside world. And our ego tells us we need to do that. It's a constant sort of nagging voice. And the problem, many problems with it, but the primary one is that we can never relax. We can never be fully present because that's where our energy is going. There's little joy in our lives because we're constantly preoccupied with how we're doing, how are we performing up to standard? So any sort of crack in the crevice of our public persona, our public self proves, might just remind us that we're defective, that we're lacking in some way. And we perfectionists rarely give ourselves a break, even when we succeed, because whenever whatever success we achieve, it's not enough because there's always the next thing. There's always someone who did better, or we should have done better, or we should do better the next time. And this is where comparing mind really kicks in as part of perfectionism. And often when we find ourselves constantly comparing ourselves to others, to the world, it's a major indicator that we're locked into perfectionistic expectations. And if that's the case, suffering is guaranteed. If we drill down, we can see that perfectionism is often an attempt to avoid rejection, avoid criticism, avoid a sense of failure, and the shame that accompanies all three of those. Perfectionism, this is the critical point about this. It's not the pursuit of excellence. It may look like that, it may appear like that, but rather it's really the avoidance of failure. Okay. So I think of it as perfectionism as an avoidance behavior. It's avoiding the shame attack that accompanies any perception that we failed, that we're not living up to those standards. Which is why achievement for perfectionists rarely brings satisfaction or joy, because there's not a sense of accomplishment. There's only a sense that we've dodged another bullet. We've gotten close enough that we've dodged another bullet. It's not perfectionists don't come in talking about all their successes. They come in and talk about all the mistakes they haven't made, all the screw ups they haven't engaged in. So that's what I mean about it's the avoidance of failure. It's not, it looks like the pursuit of excellence. It may look out on the outside to others as that, but we're struggling not to fail, not live up to those expectations. It's unsurprisingly begins in childhood. Many of us grew up in homes where the standard was, you perform to this level, whether that's athletics, whether that's grades, whether that's behavior and manners. And we see this as just epidemic in young people these days, where, they get a 4.2 and they're still worried about, can they keep it up or someone else doing better, whatever. So it's very much embedded in our culture. Parents, of course, have hopes and expectations for their children, but when the love and acceptance is based solely on performance, that's where the seeds of perfectionism get planted in a child. And as I said, our culture is another source of perfectionism. Our capitalist system, with the emphasis on competition and getting ahead and comparing ourselves to others, just encourages it, just reinforces this perfectionistic ethic that's kind of woven into the culture. Because in the free market of capitalism, only the strong survive, only the strong succeed. Okay. So Are we unable to celebrate the successes of our friends and peers with sympathetic joy? Remember one of the four Brahma Viharas, because we feel envious. I'm too busy envying your success to really celebrate it with you, to really enjoy it with you. Unfortunately, in our modern times, another contributor is social media, which sets up this sense of envy, comparison, the fear of missing out. We imagine that others are having more fun, have happier families. We have to push ourselves to be more perfect to keep up. Many of us have unprocessed expectations of you know, um, what our lives should be based on, and this comes from a lot from social media if we consume it. But in reality, there is little correlation between a person who is well adjusted and one who appears to have a perfect life. Okay. And because our practice is about reducing our suffering, especially the suffering that comes from holding ourselves to perfectionistic standards, that's why we walk this path. But we have to be diligent about not bringing, perfectionistic expectations to the path, because we can also, say, well, I'm not practicing hard enough. I'm not progressing fast enough. I'm not meditating enough. My meditations aren't good enough. All the same kind of nagging voice where the ego screaming in our ear that we need to do more, better, faster, quicker, whatever. So the first thing, once again, is always we notice when that stuff is coming up, because it will come up. When I first encountered Buddhism, it was the first antidote that I'd ever come across, for the constant pursuit of perfection that had haunted my life until I started on this path. So instead of perfection, it gave me an option to accept my life and feelings just as they were, however imperfect, however much they fell short of the expectations that I had instilled in me, in my family. So I could start to feel less ashamed about, at the core of my being, the parts of me that felt so vulnerable, the part that I spent years being ashamed about and trying to cover up, both for myself and others, by achievement, by doing better, by appearing perfect on the outside. The Buddhist path, the path of the Dharma, encourages us to make friends with our vulnerabilities, to make friends with our defects, perceived defects, our humanity, if you will, which is really synonymous with our perceived defects. It encourages us to focus on compassion, on awakening our hearts, to practice self-compassion, self-acceptance that we talked about the other day for ourselves, and to counter the perfectionistic expectations around us, so that we accept ourselves, limitations and all, warts and all, defects and all, and recognize that we all have them, that we're not alone with this. Part of the problem with perfectionism is we feel we're the only ones that feel defective or are defective. We not the victories of vanity or being beloved by the outside world through more material consumption. Those are the traps of perfectionism. Vanity, trying to get the world to love us, getting more toys, getting more things, that make us look better in the world. Yeah, they feel good momentarily. But if our self-esteem, our self-worth is built on these external conditions, then it's going to collapse once they cease, once we get older, once we get poorer, once we can't keep up. So this is why we cultivate a kind and gentle attitude toward ourselves. And it involves a lot of self-acceptance and accepting the parts of ourselves that we previously have worked so hard to hide or overcome. Okay. We allow ourselves to feel whatever we feel without judgment. This is the source of joy in our lives, that level of acceptance. Because doing or achieving stops being the lens through which we see the world and through which we see ourselves. We can just be as we are, imperfect beings, one among many of all humankind. With our practice, with patience, with kindness toward ourselves, we live day to day with more openness, with more spaciousness. And that has really been my experience. I've got a ways to go, but when I can tap into that, I can I can relax, I can feel the openness, I can feel the spaciousness. And then it's easier to extend this compassion to all who are suffering from this disease of perfectionism. It lets us naturally know we're not alone, we're not separate, we're not distinct. We are each perfect in our imperfection. We are each perfect in our humanity. We are not uh, at the bottom, at the baseline, perfect, but perfect in our imperfection. And that's the beauty of our humanity when we can recognize it, see it in others, see it in ourselves, and share it. And I'll leave you with my one of my favorite quotes. I don't know if he originated it, but as Leonard Cohen saying, "There is a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. There's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in." Leonard Cohen. So let me stop there and let's talk about perfectionism.